Hey everybody, this is like the introduction and all of that fun stuff at the beginning of Workers and Capital by Mario Tronti, translated by David Broder. The table of contents says, forward by Steve Wright, who wrote, Storming Heaven, which is like the big book on Operaismo, which I don't even know if I'm pronouncing right. But yeah, it's a good book. Introduction, A Course of Action. Notes on this edition. New section, or new part of the book. First, hypotheses. Marx yesterday and today. Factory and society. The plan of capital. A new type of political experiment. Lenin in England. An old tactic for a new strategy. 1905 in Italy. Class and party. Part 2 of the book, Initial Theses. Marx, Labor Power, the Working Class. Or Marx, Labor Power, Working Class. Chapter 1, Hegel and Ricardo. 2, the exchange of money for labor. 3, critique of ideology. 4, woe to June. 5, the particularity of the commodity labor power. 6, productive labor. 7, what the proletariat is. 8, the forms of struggle. 9, labor as non-capital. 10, the labor theory of value as watchword. 11, the class. 12, the strategy of refusal. 13, tactics equals organization. 14, the struggle against work. All right, so that's the table of contents, and then there's postscript. Oh shit, I didn't finish it. Postscript of problems, appendix, Operaismo, index. All right, here's the foreword by Steve Wright. The publication of an English-language edition of Mario Tronti's 1966 classic, Operae e Capitale, who the fuck knows, has been long awaited. 1 or 2 complete chapters have appeared in the past, together with some fragments. More recently, other sections of the book have appeared online. Now, thanks to David Broder's fine translation, a complete version of the book's second edition of 1971 is available. English language readers who had previously encountered Workers and Capital only in part, or else as refracted through second-hand commentary, are finally in a position to judge for themselves the value of Tronti's most famous text. Initially published in 1966, Operae e Capitale is the first book produced by the political tendency known as Operaismo, literally workerism, although arguments continue as whether that is a useful rendering of the word in English. Many such books followed over the next 15 years. Some of these, too, would be bestsellers. None, however, could match the shiver of recognition and excitement that Tronti's volume evoked within a large part of Italy's generation of 1968, at a time when the likes of Marcuse and Mao were as popular there as elsewhere in the West. Workers and Capital stood out amongst the local outpourings of revolutionary thought. In truth, for many Italian radical circles of the time, the book was treated as nothing less than a Bible. Above all, by the group Potere Operaio, which I think is workers' power. I'm not sure. That's just a guess. Don't quote me on that. I know nothing of Italian. Which briefly brought together a significant proportion of the country's workerists in pursuit of what Brecht once called, quote, the simple thing, so difficult to achieve, unquote. As with other political tendencies, Operaismo did not emerge one morning fully formed and complete. Instead, Operaismo's central precepts were developed over the course of the early 1960s, during which its advocates slowly differentiated themselves amongst a range of perspectives critical of the post-war practices of the mainstream left in Italy. united by a common belief that the leadership of the local communist PCI and socialist PSI parties did not understand the recent massive changes in working class composition in politics, these various dissenters offered very different solutions to this conundrum. Amongst them, the workerists insisted that, quote, a Marxian purification of Marx, end quote, was indispensable for understanding and organizing class conflict. So far, so usual. What made the Operaisti less typical, although not unique, was an equal insistence that this task could only be achieved through an encounter between Marx's critique of political economy and the realities of workplace power relations in contemporary Italy. Tronti was born into a Roman working-class family in 1931, a secretary of the university PCI branch. Tronti was one of the many party members who protested against the USSR's invasion of revolutionary Hungary. Not long afterwards, Tronti began to make a name for himself as a talented, if unconventional, writer on Marx's mature work, influenced in this by Galvano della Volpe. The latter was then unusual as a communist intellectual who read Marx closely. Tronti's early work went further and turned Marx into a goad to be used against the Communist Party's tutelary saint, Antonio Gramsci. Criticizing what he saw as the profoundly idealist outlook of the Gramsci championed by the Communist Party, Tronti argued that, quote, if philosophy coincides with good sense, we must distrust philosophy, end quote. Tronti. Footnote. What followed was the paradoxical story of a general defeat, punctuated by illusory small-scale victories. Thus it went until the end of the 1980s, when we were all forced to understand where history had ended up going. The leadership of the PCI suffered, in a subordinate mode, the same fate as the ruling classes of the country. Modernization required a passing of the baton from the generations of war and resistance to the generations of peace and development. The movement of 1968 supplied new personnel for this handover. What happened in the party was what happened in the circles of power. A new political class was not born. Rather, in its place, a new administrative class emerged, always managerial, at the level of both government and opposition. The whole Berlinguer leadership, as much with the historic compromise as with its alternative, proved to be nothing more than a tumultuous period of defense, which lined up Il Popolo Comunista to contain and slow the neo-bourgeois flood. But at that point, there was little else that could be done. In the last act of the tragedy, the Communist Party was rechristened as the Democratic Party of the Left. This was followed by the farce, when even the word, quote, party disappeared, under pressure from anti-political populism. There were no more barriers, just the flood. From the 1980s onward, neoliberal capitalist restoration sapped the workers' capacity for opposition. With the breaking of the weakest link in the anti-capitalist chain, the Soviet state, there was no longer any way to block the returning hegemonic power from taking absolute command. The newly declared dominance of capital was not just economic but social, political, and cultural. It was at once theoretical and ideological, a combination of intellectual and mass common sense. Yet it's worth stressing one final fact. For as long as the post-capitalist horizon remained open, the struggle to introduce elements of social justice within capitalism achieved some success. Once the revolutionary project was defeated, the reformist program became impossible too. In this sense, the latest form of neoliberal capitalism may prove ironically similar to the final forms of state socialism, incapable of reform, end quote. Tronti. Some questions around Gramsci's Marxism, translated by Andrew Anastasi in Viewpoint, 2016. That piece was originally... I don't know. That's weird. Because that quote's talking about 1980s, the 1980s and shit, but the footnote says 1958. So I don't know if that's okay, that quote, that quote, if philosophy coincides with good sense, we must distrust philosophy. That's from 1958. Weird. End footnote. Unlike Gramsci, Tronti did not hail any, quote, revolutions against Marx's capital, end quote. Rather, Tronti sought to, quote, engage with Marx not in his own time but in our own. Marx's capital should be judged on the basis of the capitalism of today, end quote. Tronti. The capitalism of the early 1960s was one through which Italian society was subjected to massive change. In the first place, an unprecedented industrial development underpinned by internal migration to the country's north, swelling in turn the populations of cities like Milan and Turin. Faced with such changes, the country's official labor movement seemed to Tronti and his closest associates to be ill-equipped to understand the processes in tow, let alone to formulate appropriate class strategies in response. By the late 1950s, Tronti and his immediate associates had been drawn into the national network of young militants then being assembled by Raniero Pansieri. I have a piece by Pansieri on I think it's called like the capitalist use of machinery. It's about like the political nature of like capitalism's technological substratum, which has largely been ignored by a lot of Marxists. Because like there's this kind of view of like in like a very like dogmatic traditionalist Marxism, there's very much the view that the means of production in some sense are the subject of history, right? So yeah, that's the piece that I have on by Raniero Pansieri. A dissident socialist from an older generation, Pansieri shared the skepticism of Tronti and others as to the ability of the main left-wing parties to develop a class politics adequate to a rapidly changing Italy. Recalling their time working together around the iconic journal Quaderni Rossi, Red Notebooks, Tronti would later write that, for all the differences in their outlook, Pansieri deserved to be remembered as someone who, quote, had anticipated the 1960s, end quote. A decade that in Italy culminated not only in the imposing student movement, but also in a wave of mass worker struggles that challenged the unions and the parties of the mainstream left as much as it challenged capital itself. Like Lukács's History and Class Consciousness, Workers and Capital is a collection of essays composed over a period of years. Most had previously appeared in a range of left-wing journals across the first half of the 1960s, primarily Quaderni Rossi and Classe Operaia, working class, which is what that journal translates as. I think Quaderni Rossi translates as the Red Notebooks, but I'm not sure. The view that Tronti and others began publishing in 1966, the review that Tronti and others began publishing in 1964, working class, Classe Operaia, began publishing in 1964. As a consequence, the evolution of many of the book's key themes can be traced within and across its very pages. For that reason, reading the book by beginning with its introduction can be a little deceiving, given that, quote, a course of action, end quote, was in fact the last section written for its first edition. While Tronti seems not to have revamped any of the individual components of his book, the manner in which his introduction frames the essays that follow casts the latter in a new light, as does his decision to select particular writings from Classe Operaia and treat them as part of one composite treatise. The texts that predate this journal, grouped together in the book's initial section titled First Hypotheses, set the scene for what is to follow, arguing not only that, quote, working class struggle has always objectively functioned as a dynamic moment of capitalist development, end quote, but drawing the conclusion that, quote, the bourgeois state machine today must today be broken within the capitalist factory, end quote. Still, it will take the opening sentences of the first essay of the book's second section, Lenin in England, also the editorial of Classe Operaia's first issue, for Operaismo to be ushered into being through what has since been called Tronti's, quote, Copernican revolution. Quote, at the level of socially developed capital, capitalist development is subordinate to working class struggles, end quote. Operai e Capitale is written in Workers and Capital, is written in a clear and elegant Italian that somehow manages to combine passion with the laconic. It is a style that many later imitators have tried and usually fail to mimic. And for all the talk in its pages of, quote, caution, the line of argument presented is a bold and confident one. If what was required was, quote, the theoretical rebirth of the working class viewpoint, end quote, that goal only made sense in pursuit of one goal, quote, give us the party in Italy and we will overthrow all Europe, end quote. Although Tronti once wrote apologetically to the publisher Giulio Einaudi about the book's, quote, biblical language, there is no doubt as to Workers and Capital's prophetic tone, which Broder's translation captures ably. Reviewing the book in 1967, the Communist Party Cultural Weekly Rinascita Adalberto Minucci, then one of Tronti's fiercest opponents within the PCI, made no efforts to hide his contempt for the book's, quote, subtle theological discussions, totally impermeable to an effective relationship with reality, end quote. Adalberto Minucci. As Riccardo Bellifiore and Massimiliano Tomba have argued instead, quote, when Mario Tronti, in, quote, Lenin in England, read workers' passivity, non-collaboration with unions, standoffishness and refusal as, quote, organized passivity, end quote, planned non-collaboration, end quote, polemical standoffishness, and, quote, political refusal, end quote, he was on the one hand preparing new lenses with which to read new working class behaviors, and seeking on the other new modalities of reading marked by a strongly performative value. Tronti did not intend to produce an objective reading of reality, but rather of the effects on that reality, end quote. Riccardo Bellifiore and Massimiliano Tomba, afterward to the Italian edition in Steve Wright, Storming Heaven, Class Composition and Struggle in Italian Autonomist Marxism, end footnote. Or Tronti himself later wrote, quote, the writing of a, quote, political thinker, end quote, can only be, quote, a speaking for the purpose of producing an effect, end quote. Mario Tronti. The centerpiece of Workers and Capital is the piece Marx, Labor Power, Working Class, by far the book's longest essay, more than half the original book, and the only one not to have been published in a journal before Workers and Capital's appearance. This chapter has been called, quote, perhaps the most analytical text ever written by Tronti, and it is certainly different in important ways from the others in the volume. Divided into 14 sections, Tronti's argument builds relentlessly in tracing the course by which the commodity labor power might transform itself into a revolutionary class, quote, within and against, end quote, the capital relation. The essay begins with a discussion of how Marx's notion of the uniqueness of that commodity, first and foremost, the twofold nature of its labor within capitalist production, was developed over time. If part of that development occurred through the appropriation and critique of earlier thinkers, not only Hegel but Ricardo perhaps even more so, Tronti asserts the importance for Marx of learning from the class struggle of his time. As a consequence, Tronti wants to reread the Germans' classic pamphlets on revolution in 1848, holding that, whatever their other failings, quote, they have a clear-sightedness in foreseeing future developments, quote, they have a clear-sightedness in foreseeing future developments, such as only class hatred could provide. And in these writings we see for the first time the overlapping and conjugation of the abstract concept of labor and the concrete reality of the worker, end quote. Tronti. Some of the influences on Tronti's perspectives, as set out in Marx, Labor, Power, Working Class, are clear enough. Lukács, for example, is explicitly cited in the essay, if only in passing, And we also know that the early workerists were familiar with the text by the likes of Boggs and Dunayevskaya. I don't know if, I'm not sure, but I think there was also some overlap with Socialisme Barbarie in this period. Just as there was between the Dunayevskaya and Boggs, or like the Johnson Forrest tendencies, like obviously by this point Johnson Forrest tendency had dissolved. Dunayevskaya and James had grown estranged, but there was definitely an overlap. They were facing Castoriadis and James were facing reality together, which I think Boggs, Grace Lee Boggs also helped write, if I can remember correctly. Anyhooser, yeah, that's what was I gonna say? Yeah, there's probably a relationship. I'm pretty sure there's a relationship between Socialisme Barbarie and Operaismo, or like the people that the theorists at least, because they were talking about very similar things. Especially like workers' inquiry and like this the focus on like the factory floor and like class conflict, as opposed to like structure. Anyway, but if Lukács had insisted that only the proletariat could make sense of capitalist society, if Boggs had prophesied an impending, quote, workless society, unquote, and if Dunayevskaya had traced the ways in which working class struggle had acted to force along capitalist development, Tronti's Marx Labor Working Class represents an extremely ambitious attempt to combine and move beyond these insights. The essay ends by presenting two separate, if parallel, understandings of political struggle needed to challenge capital. The refusal of work that springs from the very nature of the capital relation, the urgency of the party that requires a Lenin for its success. If the precise contours of the way forward are left hanging, it is also true that the central pivot remains the party, understood as, quote, the organization of what already exists within the class, but which the class alone cannot succeed in organizing, end quote. Whilst Workers and Capital is unquestionably the foundational text of Operaismo, it is worth noting nonetheless that what is absent from the book. Like many others, I believe the theme of class composition to be workerism's most original contribution. What overt discussion of class composition exists in its pages, however, really only appears in the long essay on Marx, and even this is limited in terms of any exploration of method or analysis. In a similar fashion, there is no examination of the, quote, mass worker forged within the mass production and that underpinned the consumer durable sector, another crucial political touchstone of workerism by the late 1960s, when this subject was widely heralded as the preeminently revolutionary actor. Instead, the first edition of the book closes with an admission that, quote, if the abolition of work by the working class and the violent destruction of capital are one and the same, end quote, no one had yet addressed the, quote, most obscure aspect of the whole process, ... What has happened within the working class since Marx? What has happened within the working class since Marx, end quote. In a similar way, a reader looking for examples of Operaismo's direct engagement with concrete struggles and concrete workplaces and communities of the period is similarly obliged to turn elsewhere. The sometimes meandering but always rich accounts offered by Romano Alquati, or even to novels such as Nani Balestrini's We Want Everything. I don't know if I've read that. I feel like I might have read that at one point. It is a very good one. I've read one of Nani Balestrini's books like 10 years ago. And it was good. It was a good book. Like as just like a book, like a kind of like a semi-novelized autobiography. I can't remember which one I read. Anyway, who cares what I read? Or despite all the talk of moving, quote, from factory to society, end quote, is there any analysis or even acknowledgement of what today is called the realm of social reproduction? And yet, for all its apparent abstractness in parts, Workers and Capital still managed to resonate across the 1960s and 1970s with a large number of militants in Italy, inspiring in them a commitment to class self-organization. And if Sergio Bologna is to be believed, this is because Tronti's words were able to, quote, to provide a synthesis for the thousands of cues transmitted through everyday experience in contact with a working class then in the process of stirring itself, end quote. Bologna. Since multiple pathways could and were read into workers and capital by those who heeded the book's call to action in the 1960s and 1970s, the directions that various operisti came to follow in its wake were often diverse. Think of the whole suite of practices and analyses that are commonly folded into the slogan, quote, wages for housework, end quote. One suspects that Tronti may have been almost embarrassed by what many other workerists made of his writings, especially the young hotheads who had joined Antonio Negri first in Potere Operaio and then in and around the movement of Autonomia Operaia. For Tronti, in contrast, Operaismo ended with the 1960s, which closed off one set of political problems while simultaneously opening new ones. Seen in this light, if many of the arguments set out in the book's 1971 postscript can be made to build upon what Tronti had written previously, then they do so in a manner that in turn lays down the foundation for a subsequent perspective of, quote, the autonomy of the political, end quote, with its focus upon the, quote, political institutional, end quote, dimension of the capitalist state form. Indeed, the course subsequently chosen by Tronti is already hinted at in the final word of his postscript to the second edition, which calls for, quote, never yet seen techniques allowing the working class to make political use of the capitalist economic machine, end quote. Tronti. Having returned his focus to the PCI as the most appropriate vehicle for this project, Tronti's own notes introducing the second edition are brief, even curt, suggesting that he was now keen to move on from these earlier explorations. Quote, the, quote, next errors, end quote, will not be of this same type, end quote. Tronti. As for how useful workers and capital might still prove on this score, that is the task best left for a new generation of readers. Okay. Now we're on to the introduction. And I've already decided while reading this, I'm going to skip a lot of the first part of the book and just go to the one on Marx, because that's what I'm actually interested in reading here. So I'm probably not going to read this whole book, at least not in the near future. Anyway, introduction, a course of action. We should start with a note of caution. Even all this is still just the, quote, prologue to heaven, end quote. Here, we are not presenting research that has already been signed and sealed. Let's leave the little schemas up to the great improvisers. Let's leave intricate but blind analyses up to the pedants. We're interested in all that has the power to grow and develop. We're interested in getting the message across that today this power lies almost exclusively in the hands of working class thought. Almost exclusively. For while the capitalist theoretical viewpoint of their own society has today entered its decadent phase, this does not mean that bourgeois thought is dead. The boss's science is now condemned to its long twilight, but there will continue to be some flashes of practical thought that still strike us now and then. The quicker the working class point of view advances, the sooner history's condemnation of bourgeois thought will be complete. In this, then, lies one of our political tasks for today. We need, through the march of research, of experiments and experiences, of discoveries, to recreate the sense, the form of a path, and to give this path the form of a process. The thing that the capitalist side will soon be unable to grasp on the terrain of the class struggle is not the concept of science itself, but the concept of the development of science. If a partial thought, a class thought, sets in motion the mechanisms of its own creative growth, then this fact alone will deny space to the development of any other scientific point of view on society. The blows it deals push this other viewpoint back into mere self-repetition, leaving this other viewpoint no other possibility than to contemplate the dogmas of its own tradition. This is what happened historically after Marx, when capitalist theories once again got the upper hand. The margins for the development of working class thought were cut back to the minimum and almost disappeared. It took the Leninist initiative, making a practical break at a determinate point, for the theoretical brain of the contemporary world to be delivered back into revolutionary hands. That was one moment. As everyone knows, after that moment, it was only capital that proved able to grasp the scientific significance of the October Revolution, hence the long lethargy of our own thought. The relationship between the two classes is such that whoever has the initiative wins. On the terrain of science, as on the terrain of practice, the strength of either side is inversely proportional to the other. If one grows and develops, the other stays put and thus slips backwards. The theoretical rebirth of the working class viewpoint is necessary today, even just to meet the needs of the struggle. If we want to start going forward again, then we need to immobilize the enemy, better to be able to strike him. The working class today is so mature that it will not accept political adventures on the terrain of material confrontations. That is true, in fact, as in principle. But happily, on the terrain of the theoretical struggle, all the conditions seem to be imposing a new spirit of adventurous discovery on the class. Faced with bourgeois thought in its feeble old age, perhaps only now can the working class point of view enjoy the fertile season of its own vibrant youth. To do this, it must violently break with its own immediate past. It must reject the traditional figure that has been officially attributed to it and surprise the class enemy with its sense of initiative, making a sudden, unpredicted, uncontrollable theoretical advance. And it is worth making our partial contribution to this new genre, to this modern form of political work. Rightly, we are asked, by what route do we propose to do this? By what means? For now, let's do without any discourse on method. We'll try not to give anyone the opportunity to dodge the hard, practical contents of working class research by dwelling on the fine methodological forms of the social sciences. The relationship to be established with these latter is no different from the one which we could entertain with the world of human knowledge accumulated thus far, in which all comes together in that set of technical knowledges necessary to grasping the objective functions of present-day society. All of us, together, must come to use so-called, quote, culture like one would use a hammer and a nail to hang a picture. For our part, we are doing it already. Of course, major feats are pulled off in sudden leaps, and the discoveries that really count often break the thread of continuity. And they are recognized as such precisely because these ideas of simple men seem like madness to the bearers of science. In this sense, Marx's place has not been fully appreciated, not even where this would have been easiest, on the terrain of theoretical thought alone. Every day we are hearing about Copernican revolutions by individuals who have pushed their desks from one corner of the room to the other. But, in the case of Marx, who have returned to social knowledge that had lasted for millennia, we only go so far as to say that he turned Hegel's dialectic upside down. Yet there is no lack of examples, contemporary to Marx, of a similar, purely critical reversal of the perspective adopted by a millennia-old science. Can all of Marx possibly be reduced to the banality of a first-grader's sum, adding Feuerbach's materialism to Hegel's conception of history? What of the discovery of non-Euclidean geometry, from which Gauss to Lobachevsky to Bolyai to Riemann made the indivisibility of the axiom nothing less than a plurality of hypotheses? What of the discovery of the concept of, quote, field, end quote, in the terrain of electrical science, which, from Faraday to Maxwell and Hertz, exploded all of mechanistic physics for the first time? Do these not seem rather close to the sense, the spirit, the scope of Marx's discoveries? Does not the new framing of space-time, introduced by relativity, take its cue from those revolutionary theories, just as the Leninist October set off on its path from the pages of Capital? But you can see this. Any intellectual who has read more than 10 books, other than the ones required for school, is prepared to consider Lenin a dead dog. Is quite prepared to consider Lenin a dead dog when it comes to the field of science. Yet whoever looks at society and wants to understand society's laws can do this without reference to Lenin only as much as whoever wants to understand natural processes could today do without Einstein. There is no mystery in this. Here we are not talking about some indivisible human spirit that makes the same advance in every field. It is something rather more serious than that. It is that unifying power that provides capital structures their dominance over the entire world, and which can, in turn, be dominated only by the working class's labor. Marx credited Benjamin Franklin, the man of the New World, with the most conscious analysis of exchange value as labor time, and thus the first conscious reduction of value to labor. And it had also been Franklin who conceived of electrical phenomena as something produced by a very fine substance that pervaded the entire universe. Before the bourgeois side constituted itself as a class under the pressure of the working class, on more than one occasion, the bourgeois brain did find the strength to unite multiple given experiences under a single concept. Subsequently, the immediate needs of the struggle quite rightly began to command the production of ideas itself. The era of analysis, the age of the social division of intellectual labor, had begun, and no longer did anyone now know something about everything. Which poses the question, is a new synthesis possible or necessary? Bourgeois science is pregnant with ideology, just as the capitalist production relation is pregnant with the class struggle. From the viewpoint of capital's interest, it is ideology that lays the basis for science. For this reason, it founds it as a generalizing social science. What had earlier been a discourse on humanity and on the world, society, and the state, increasingly becomes a mechanism objectively functional to the economic machine as the level of struggle rises. Today's social science is like the production apparatus of modern society. Everyone is within it and uses it, but only the bosses draw the profits. You cannot smash it apart, we are told, without pitching mankind back into barbarism. As a first objection, we might ask who said that human civilization is indeed capital's dearest concern. And modern workers know of very different ways of defeating capital behind the prehistoric cry, quote, "let's break the machines," end quote. In short, big industry and big industry's science are not the prize for whoever wins the class struggle. They are the battlefield itself. Big industry and big industry's science are the battlefield itself. And so long as the enemy occupies that field, we must spray that field with bullets, without crying over the roses that get destroyed along the way. Today, a great new season of theoretical discoveries is possible only from the working class point of view, difficult as that is to admit for those who fear it. The possibility, the capacity for synthesis lies wholly in working class hands, and there's a simple reason for that. For today, the synthesis can only be a unilateral synthesis. It can only be a consciously class science, the science of a class. If we base ourselves on capital, the whole can be understood only from the perspective of the part. Knowledge is connected to the struggle. Whoever has true hatred has truly understood. That is why the working class can know everything of capital, grasp the whole thing, simply because it is capital. It is the enemy of everything and even itself. Despite this fact, capitalists face an unsurmountable limit to their knowledge of their own society precisely because they have to defend and preserve it. And the workers can know everything, but sometimes it is instead impressive how little they know of their own selves. To set oneself on the side of the totality, humanity, society, the state, leads only to a partial analysis, leads us to grasp only detached parts, and leads us to lose scientific oversight over the whole. Bourgeois thought has condemned itself to this every time. Bourgeois thought has uncritically accepted its own ideology. and working class thought has condemned working class thought's self to this fragmentary view every time that working class thought has swallowed the bourgeois ideology of the general interest. There have been moments in which the individual capitalist crude practice has, conveniently enough, covered up for that individual capitalist's class's whole awesome theoretical void and rendered it harmless. In other moments, the collective capitalist has responded decisively to the impulse of the direct interest of the bosses as expressed from below. On those occasions, there was a leap forward in the development of the body of bourgeois science itself. Lord Keynes is a splendid example of this. Through the deadly class conflict of our epoch, though not by any other means, the great bourgeois consciousness of the contemporary period, this critical, destructive consciousness, has at times had moments of lucid, totalizing awareness of the present conditions of human social relations. This is the story of a few outstanding individuals, classic individuals in the tragic sense, from Mahler to Musil. Or Musil, I don't know how to say that. He wrote The Man Without Qualities or something like that. I don't know. In kickstarting the development of working class thought, we must evaluate anew the active side of creative labor and do so by starting again from the beginning. This demands that we get the mechanism of discovery moving again, but such a mechanism can only be in the grip of those who have long adopted a correct political stance toward the social object, that is, a stance simultaneously both within and against society, a partial view that theoretically grasps the totality, precisely as they struggle to destroy this totality in practice, a vital moment in all that exists, and thus an absolute power of decision over its survival. And this, indeed, is the condition of workers as a class, faced with capital as a social relation, a new synthesis from the working class side, firmly grasped in its hands, will tear all possibility of science from the hands of the bosses. The more necessary it becomes for the working class point of view to launch a great new theoretical initiative, the more impossible it becomes for the capitalist side to take such an initiative. Whoever is on our side can rest easy then. If you see us abandoning the fossilized forest of vulgar Marxism, this is not because we want to run around the stadiums of contemporary bourgeois thought. When Marx criticized the high points of capitalist development, many took Marx for a reactionary, for he was turning his nose up at the last word in modern history. Marx's reply was simple and unambiguous. We are against constitutionalism, but that does not mean that we are for absolutism. We are against the present society, but that does not mean we are for the world of the past. Some today criticize us for the contradiction of mounting a working class critique of the workers' movement, but Marx's reply equally well answers that objection. We are against the present organization of struggle and research, but that does not mean that we take the practical and theoretical solutions of the past as our model. Saying no to today's socialism does not mean having to say yes to yesterday's capitalism. Lenin said, quote, "When it comes to philosophy, I am one of those who search," end quote. Lenin. In philosophy today, there is nothing left to search for, but when it comes to the problems that concern us, from the perspective of unleashing the decisive struggle against the power of capital, there are unknown worlds that are waiting to be explored. The fate of those who sought another route to India and ended up discovering other continents is very similar to our own present manner of proceeding. For this reason, it is fair enough that the seeds of the new have not yet grown to the maturity of a fruit-bearing plant. It is important to recognize the force of what is being born. If it is alive, it will grow. You can criticize someone who is still continuing their research for what they have not yet found. Faraday discovered induced currents, the induction relations between magnets, current, and the electric field. Someone asked Faraday, "What is the discovery useful for?" Faraday's reply, "What is a child useful for?" Whitehead comments that once this, quote, child had grown up to become a man, it constituted the basis for all modern applications of electricity. The research work on this small body of hypotheses, born in Italy in the 1960s, not by accident, now finds itself at a delicate, decisive turning point. This research has set down some of its theoretical premises, which are only apparently abstract. it has attempted some political experiments of its own, which in reality have necessarily been rough and primitive. It has thus arrived at an initial heap of conclusions. Once again, theoretical conclusions, in which, half concretely, half fantastically, it is possible to find the germ of new laws of motion. And we need to present all of this in block. The whole thing needs to be put to the test, in public, before we can go any further. The chronological succession of the texts purports to represent a logical development of our argument itself, but that may not be the case. There may be errors within the nooks and crannies of our accumulated thoughts and experiences, which are difficult to see from the inside, but easy to uncover from an external standpoint. If that is the case, we need to identify and correct these errors, and do it together. A discourse that takes itself as its own foundation runs the lethal risk of checking itself only by the yardstick of the formal logical continuity between its own successive stages. Rather, we need to choose the point at which we can consciously succeed in breaking this logic. It is not enough, then, to lower theoretical hypotheses down into lived experience in order to see if they function in practice. The hypotheses themselves need to be negated through exhaustive political work that prepares the terrain for their real verification. Only once the ground is prepared politically can these hypotheses operate materially, factually, in practice. But this is a complex line of argument, and perhaps we ought to express it rather more straightforwardly. What do Marx, Lenin, and past working class experience mean for us? Different things to what they mean for others, no doubt. And that is quite right. Others, everyone, found therein the very things we think we should not be looking for. A new intellectual grasp on the world, thus providing a new orientation for one's studies, a new life science, and thus the ability to go calmly about choosing a place for ourselves in society, and a new consciousness of history. This latter is the worst and most dangerous thing of all, for it means putting a rubber stamp on the deed that places the workers' lost human essence back in their own hands. This essence is but a bequest granted by the dying boss, and for good reason. It is rejected and disdained by living labor. But we should not be looking for just anything. Rather, we should be searching for some things over others. This is the only useful approach to take. That is also how one travails in the world of classics. In so doing, we will find stones along the road more precious than the gold in the mines, bearings to orient us in the day-to-day class struggle, crude weapons for the offensive against the domineering boss, without any decorative embellishments or any illustrious values. In so doing, we find a mounting succession of practical criteria for working-class political action. Each criterion is consciously adopted, one after another, and each level of action is subjectively raised above the last. All this has the aim of inverting the subaltern nature of the demands advanced by the working class, depicting them as a force that threatens dominion over all society. This means tearing the direction and control of the class struggle from the brain of capital, and putting it once and for all in the fists of the workers. This succession, the path of struggle, this political growth of our class, starts out from Marx's oeuvre, I can't remember how to pronounce that word, and passes by way of Lenin's initiative. Its development leaps forward in decisive moments of practical experience that have a directly working class character, and it does not stop here, it goes beyond all this. And we, too, must be able to go beyond this, with an attitude towards this process that half foresees the future and half monitors the present, in part anticipating, in part following. Anticipating means thinking, seeing many things at once, seeing them in development, watching everything with theoretical eyes and from the point of view of our own class. Following means acting, moving at the real level of social relations, measuring the material state of the present forces, grasping the moment in the here and now to snatch the initiative in the struggle. Broad strategic anticipations of capitalist development are certainly needed, then, but they are needed precisely as limit concepts within which we can pin down the tendencies of the objective movement of things. We should never confuse these anticipations with the real situation, and never take these anticipations as an unescapable destiny for the world to which we must then conform. In certain moments, the possibility of getting a sense of the struggle and of organization lies exactly in the ability to foresee capital's objective path and its needs within the terms of this path. We must thwart the fulfillment of these necessities and thus block capital's development, pitching it into crisis before, sometimes long before, is achieved the ideal conditions that we have ourselves contemplated. Similarly, the modes of concrete action, the true and proper laws of tactics, are certainly also indispensable, but they are indispensable precisely as functions that must be made to serve an overall perspective which entirely stands beyond these laws. We must never isolate these laws from one another or confuse these laws with long-term objectives, and we must never present these laws as something autonomous, as if these laws were themselves the whole battlefield, themselves the ultimate purpose. This theoretical vigilance, by which the working class is continuously forced to abide, is pertinent precisely because it is sometimes necessary to break the chain of historical happenings, which so often present themselves anew in too similar a guise. It is necessary to judge these experiences afresh and select only some of them as models in light of the latest developments, the latest foresights, the latest discoveries. When we run back through the history of worker struggles and look into the eyes of those who headed and represented them, we can really see how these dualisms, anticipating and following, foresight and oversight, clear ideas and the will to action, wisdom and ability, far-sightedness and concreteness, have always appeared divorced from or even dispersed across different figures. This condition is death for the theoretical viewpoint of the working class. As for its political action, this condition is what explains the miserable life of the official workers' movement today. In this sense, the situation is grave, and the words in a book will certainly not be enough to change that. Such a volume may contain an element of truth only on condition that it is written in full awareness that we are doing something rather dreadful. If, in order to be able to act, we first need to write, then our level of struggle must be very backward indeed. Words, however you choose them, always strike you as something bourgeois. But this is how things are. In an enemy society, we cannot freely choose the means we use to fight it. And the weapons of proletarian revolt have always been taken from the boss's arsenals. The research must therefore keep going forward, in this form and with this consciousness, and as it proceeds beyond each confine, its task will become much more complex, more difficult, and more strenuous. Up till this point, we could work with the fabric of the classics, adding some embellishments of our own. But from here on out, a new cloth must be woven, cut and sewn into the expanded horizons of today's workers' struggles. After Marx, no one has known anything new about the working class. It still remains an unknown continent. We know that it exists, of course, because we've all heard it being talked about. And anyone can read all manner of fabulous tales about it, but no one can say, I saw, I understood. A few sociologists have tried to demonstrate that it no longer really exists. The capitalist has sacked it because it didn't know how to do its job. How is the working class composed internally? How does the working class function within capital? How does the working class work? How does the working class struggle? In what sense does the working class tacitly accept the system, and in what form does the working class strategically refute the system? These are the key issues, and there are just as many questions. In the coming years, we'll have to know our theory as well as history as well as theory. Like Brecht's Galileo, we'll try to advance inch by inch, quote, before we assume they are spots, which is what would suit us best. We should assume that they are fried fish, end quote. I guess that's Brecht. With a, quote, demanding and fruitful gaze, end quote, developing our own, quote, external eye, end quote, we will observe the flickering lamp of the class struggle today. The greater our amazement as we surprise ourselves watching its flickering, the closer we will be to discovering its laws. In our research thus far, we very much kept in mind this lesson on method, and it led us to discover things that had not been visible to the naked eye. and all this is negligible compared to all of the things that we could have discovered proceeding along this route. It serves only to introduce our discourse, and even here we may be mistaken. Yet it is difficult to deny the sense that today, lying open ahead of us, there is a path toward a new type of Marxist research, and likewise that the dogmatic long night of working class thought is coming to an end. Indeed, the ocean of possible discoveries has become so stormy that we need great powers of self-control to navigate it without putting all the old analytical instruments out of use. We have to keep our eyes rigorously fixed on our object of observation, without backing away from our object of observation, and over a long period. And this object is present-day society, the society of capital. The society of capital's two classes, the struggle between these classes, their histories and the prognoses of their development. To whoever asks what will come after, we can only respond, we do not know yet. This is a problem that we have to arrive at, not one we can start out from. And we have not yet reached our destination. This is one of the reasons why, in this whole discourse, the future seems not to exist. Indeed, none of what stands in front of us today is the future. And to base the model for a future society on the analysis of present-day society is a bourgeois ideological vice, an inheritance that only oppressed plebs and vanguard intellectuals can adopt as their own. This is the fanfare at the front of a march, or a reward for bowing and scraping, with the promise that the world of the righteous awaits in the afterlife. No worker who is fighting against a boss is going to ask, quote, and then what, end quote. The fight against the boss is everything. The organization of this struggle is everything. This constitutes a whole world, and we agree the whole world needs tearing down. But who told you that the mere will to overthrow power, a will organized as a ruling class, is not enough to tear it down? On the one side, the working class, on the other, capitalist society. That is how the class struggle is plotted out today. It is not true that this shifts the relationship of forces in capital's favor. No, the opposite is true. For this is the only way in which the working class can acquire strength for itself and indeed recognize its strength as the only living, active, productive element of society, as the hinge of social relations, as the fundamental articulation of economic development, and thus a class that potentially already holds in its fists political domination over the present. The revolutionary process through which this domination is realized may also include some stages when the forward motion is forced to leap across a few phases. But at the apex of development, when power has been ripped out of the capitalist hands, there comes a tough period in which the workers exercise political dictatorship over the whole society, and that phase cannot be jumped across. This is the greatest future that we can see on the horizon, the one we want to see. As an objective for struggle, this will do just fine. As a way of organizing the struggle, it serves our purposes. Nothing more can be said. For us today, prophecies on the new world, on the new humanity, on the new human community, look as foul as apologias for a shameful past. No, the problem today is not a matter of envisioning what ought to replace the old world. We're still facing the issue of how to tear it down. So, it remains essential to know that old world, its direction and logic, its operational forces in many struggles. What concerns us, then, is not a matter of elaborating the argument in this vein. We can anticipate a lot of this concrete future, which also needs doing. This indeed is the recovery of the importance of theory. But at this point, a real question is posed that demands a real answer, and a real answer is anything but easy to provide. The young comrade who rightly wants to struggle against a living enemy immediately asks a very apposite question. What, in the meantime, are the margins of practical activity? What are the actions most suited to tracking and remaining vigilant in the present? And how can this active presence over things today be connected and reconciled with theoretical discoveries on new continents. This decade, the 1960s, in Italy, will never be sufficiently considered in its positive aspect. A fortunate combination of conditions, directly capitalist and directly working class ones, has opened up a process in which revolutionary forces are growing as they go through a decisively important turning point. These years have been rich in experiences, and the thing with experiences, when they are indeed new in type, when they break with the present officialdom and tradition, is that some people have them, make them happen, others do not. This is not a dividing line, though. Those who have not experimented with the new experiences have repeated old ones in a critical fashion. Indeed, that is how each person can make forward steps when young. There is a wisdom difficult to practice, because at first it exists only embryonically, and we gain it only once the opportunity has passed, namely, the wisdom of carrying out objective political work with the even murky consciousness that we are building up an experience only for ourselves, a function of the hypotheses built up in our heads so that we can test and develop them. An experiment of this nature never seems to leave any trace. In reality, what does remain is the fundamental premise for doing everything. That is the maturation of a discourse that offers perspective and of the subjective forces that can begin to make it operational. The practical turning point must contain all of these dimensions. The level reached by discourse, the maturation of the forces that can carry it forward, the miraculously favorable class situation in Italy, demand that in this moment we no longer attempt practical experiences that serve theoretical discovery. They demand a political labor of deeds, a creative labor that seeks to deploy strength and the ability to achieve concrete results, material advances. We should know in advance this political labor will be entirely beyond our theoretical horizon, and it must always be beyond it. Every time that we again try to begin a revolutionary process, preparing the conditions, gathering the forces, and organizing the party. Yes, that's right, organizing the party. There are moments in which all problems can and should be reduced to this problem alone. These are highly advanced moments of the class struggle, and we ought not always go and look for them at the points where capital has ripened most or where capitalism is at its weakest. Here, too, with the courage of discovery, outside of the theoretical schemas which someone may have been growing in their own garden, we need to know how to find the place, the point where a chain of circumstances is left a single knot to unravel for the thread of the revolutionary movement to resume its onward march. The knot of the party, the conquest of organization. It can never be reaped enough that to foresee capital's development does not mean submitting to capital's iron laws. Rather, it means forcing it to take a certain road, waiting in ambush at some point with weapons more powerful than iron, where we can attack and smash it. Too many today believe that the history of the workers' movement in the most advanced countries is a fatal destiny for us, which we will not be able to escape. But isn't knowing what is about to happen useful precisely for those who want to stop it happening? For finding the ways, the forms, the forces to make sure it doesn't happen? What other powers would it have? To give us tomorrow's horoscope, perhaps? The history of modern social democracy, of modern working class reformism, is still all to be written, and this will require a lot of work. But, politically speaking, its fundamental processes are evident enough. No one can deny that the victory of social democracy is a defeat for the working class. It can likewise be taken for granted that this defeat ought not be blamed on the workers themselves, and yet you will find few prepared to admit as much. We can understand why. If the workers have not directly made errors themselves, then these errors must be attributed to the workers' leaders. If it was not the class, in its necessarily spontaneous action, that misread the signs of the fight against social democracy, then the misreading instead lies at the door of those who ought to have functioned as the organizers, also including, in our view, authentic workers' leaders and proven revolutionaries. In this vein, we today need a profound and concise critique of all the positions of the historical left wing of the international workers' movement, which ought to be charged not with having blocked social democracy's onward march, but rather with having aided social democracy's onward march. The first Bolshevik response ought to be implicated in this critique, too. Certainly it was no chance thing that when the communist movement did win at certain points, the left's positions toward it committed the same errors as always. The right's positions were not demolished but simply turned on their head. When the right made day-to-day tactics into a long-term strategy, the left responded by making long-term strategy into a day-to-day tactic. It opposed the false realism of practice with phony abstract theorizations. In rejecting the popular movement, it closed itself down in the isolation of the group. The historic parties of the workers' movement have had an easy time because to their left there have always been, and still are, Zarathustra-type blowhards who go around promising to tear down the world but wouldn't be able to tell how to brush, who wouldn't be able to tell you how to brush the dust off their ancient sacred texts. Sorry, I lost my spot. In the meantime, the workers learned that neither the brutality of compromise with the enemy nor the response provided by the moral force Chartism concerned them, their interest, and their class war. These workers had themselves taken on leading the insurrection. When it came to hand-to-hand combat with the reformist perspective that then seemed to be so invincible, precisely because it had already won in other, much more advanced countries, it is true in that case that together with the workers at the head of the insurrection, there was also Lenin, and Lenin alone among all the leaders of the revolution in Europe had always remained faithful to an elementary principle of subversive practice, to what was for him a commandment for all practice, never leave the party in the hands of those already in charge. Lenin had understood, through his work and his study, that even for the Russia of that time, the knot that had to be unraveled was the party. Whether within or outside the party, whether in the majority or in the minority, without ruling out any means that served the ultimate purpose, the party struggle and the open struggle for the leadership of the organization is the red thread that runs through Lenin's life and works and led both to the reckoning of 1917. And then, by one of those miracles that are, in fact, only miracles for those who do not know the laws of action, at the right moment the party happened to be in the right hands. Quote, 6th of November is too early, 8th of November is too late, end quote. This watchword, which would long remain the model for any revolutionary decision, became possible at precisely that point, with those forces and for those objectives. We think that the model provided by Lenin's initiative is a lesson that we still need to learn. We ought to attend this same school each day. It is there that we will grow. It is there that we will prepare ourselves, until we manage to read things directly without the foul mediation of books, until we are able to violently reshape reality without the cowardice of the ponderous intellectual. In this way, we will learn that tactics are not written on the tables of the law once and for all time. Rather, they are an invention to be made each day, a harmony with real things and at the same time a freedom from any preconceived ideas. They are a kind of productive imagination that alone serves to make thought work amid the facts. They are the real leap to be made, if only for those who know what needs doing. If you know how to look for them, in this book you will find a series of changes in the way in which we consider this problem, and it is only right that they remain there to see. This shows how these advances were made over time. There is no static equilibrium between political work and theoretical discoveries. There is a relationship in movement that makes the one serve the other according to the needs of the moment. Today there seem to be no doubts as to the need to dump all discovery and of the urgent need to resume practical activity in the correct way. The coming years in Italy will be decisive. Everyone can feel it. Few have understood, though, that they will be decisive not just for Italy, but likewise for international capital. To consider the Italian class situation, quote, normal, or fatally doomed to follow the normal path of the countries that went before us in modern history is the typical error of pure strategy, and this view in itself represents a troubling display of a lack of political sensibility. Indeed, there is a living example of the way in which, on the basis of leftist positions, one can turn the official line of the workers' movement on its head without touching its true contents, which for us are always given by the relationship concretely established within us, within the working class's level of political development and with its degree of organization. In this sense, if anyone today imagines that the answer to every question that faces us is to be found in the United States, because Marx told us that man explains the ape and not the other way around, this is but a form of theoretical orthodoxy that itself naively contributes to the mishmash that is today's vulgar Marxism, in which the only thing that you will never find is the working class initiative in the class struggle in a determinate time and place. To see the underdeveloped countries as being at the epicenter of the revolution, simply because Lenin said that the chain will be broken at the weakest link, is a way of being practically concrete that also coincides with what is perhaps the highest form of contemporary opportunism, so theoretically illiterate as to be unable to tell which part of the paper tiger is the head and which is the tail. The point at which, through a combination of historical factors, the working class's degree of political development is advanced beyond the economic level of capitalist development, still today remains the most favorable site for the opening up of a revolutionary process in the short term. On that condition, here we are talking about the working class and capitalist development in the scientific sense of two social classes in an era in which they have already reached maturity. The thesis that today the chain must be broken not where capital is weakest, but rather where the working class is strongest, is indeed very dear to us, even where the argumentation to back up this thesis is still insufficient. It ought to be granted particular attention. A lot of things can derive from this, like the, quote, mean value theorem, end quote, the possibility of taking one point that is itself in movement and using it to grasp what lies ahead as the tendency of things, and what lies in the past as a passive inheritance. There is good reason why Italy today offers ideal terrain for working class theoretical research. If we start from here, and with this concreteness, in order to look out on the world of capital, precisely because it is in the middle of capitalist development in its international extension, the Italian class situation, still today favorable to workers, can become a moment for the subjective unification of different and opposed levels of struggle, if it is true that it is urgent and perhaps a precondition for everything else that would put international revolutionary strategy back on its feet. We should understand that this cannot be done so long as we continue to play with the child's atlas invented by bourgeois political geography, which, for bourgeois political geography's own didactic convenience, is divided into the first, second, and third worlds. It is high time we began to distinguish between the different degrees, levels, and successive determinations of capitalist contradictions, without each time confusing them for an alternative to the system. An alternative to the system. Capitalist society is made in such a way that capitalist society can only allow for one single alternative, the directly working class alternative. All the rest are the very contradictions that feed capital, and without which it could not live. It would certainly do so rather less if it knew how, but it often knows it only post festum, always after the critical moment has passed. This is a good thing for us. From the working class point of view, capitalist contradictions should neither be rejected nor resolved, but only utilized. But making use of these contradictions also demands that we exacerbate them, even when they present themselves as ideals of socialism, and they proceed under the banner of labor. The task of theory is to reconstruct the chain of contradictions, to connect it again, and to grasp it anew, by way of the class's collective thought as our enemy's single development process, hence the need for a strategic renaissance of the international workers' movement. At the same time, we must start again from a determinate level or point of development to set a concrete revolutionary process in motion again, indeed on its own legs. This is the task of practice. This is the prodigious rediscovery of the world of tactics, which the class situation in Italy each day compels us to mount. It would be wrong to maintain that the international web of the most developed capital is now so dense, even at the institutional level, that it would not allow a hole to show up at any point. Never overestimate the enemy. Never take a subordinate position toward the enemy, and never give up the initiative in the struggle. Precisely because the web is getting denser, to force a rupture at some point means bringing together at this same point all the forces that want to break the web as a whole. Every further link between the various parts of capital is a further channel of communication between the diverse constituents of the working class. Every deal among capitalists presupposes and recommences, despite itself, a process of working class unification, and does not even take much thinking. If the working class today had a new and high-level experience of political organization, this would represent a powerful spark, a subversive drive, a model of the revolutionary path for both the advanced capitalist countries and the ones whose capitalism is most backward. Even a minimum of practical intuition, a feeling of class instinct, today sets this reality directly before our eyes. Again, here you ought not to ask right away, what will the party be like? There are some who have already begun to consider this word too corrupt for us to go on using it, and perhaps they are right. But we have not yet gone this far, and for now we do not want to. In the sky of theoretical discoveries, it is only right to fly on the wings of an intelligent fantasy, but on the terrain of practice, and when we are addressing the most difficult problem of all, the question of organization, we ought to proceed carefully, with humanity and due caution, speaking everyday prose. Yes, we need to jump from one form to the other, but we should do this without losing anything of the positive potential of the real experiences built up through decades of tough struggle. It may seem strange, it isn't. But when we speak of the party, this is the only time in which we feel like the old generation. To put that better, this is the moment in which we look at all the other problems with the consciousness of a transitional generation, compelled to anticipate the future using means from the past. We should then be talking about a party struggle to conquer organization, a Leninist tactic within a strategic research project of a new type, and a revolutionary process at one point that can set the mechanism of the international revolution in motion again. Faced with the question of, quote, what is to be done, end quote, one possible answer has arisen, that all of us spend the next few years working, guided by the single orientation, give us the party in Italy, and we will overthrow all of Europe, exclamation point. Only recently has this answer arisen. In a capitalist society, the slow and imperceptible path of historical development is a mad rush of ephemeral political moments. We have to know how to position ourselves among these moments and how to grasp each of them, and all of these that follow, if indeed we want to lay hold of the thread that ties them together, and which must itself be broken. These are not the old historic opportunities for which one awaits on the street corner, nor is this a matter of restoring the continuity between events, as if they were all equal to one another, and none of them marked a break with the past. We need to understand that it is precisely this phenomenon that takes away the general character of the eras of history and makes each into the field of action for a determinate struggle. Discovering the necessities of capital's development and inverting the necessities of capital's development, so the necessities of capital's development become the working class's opportunities for subversion. These are the two elementary tasks of theory and practice, of science and politics, of strategy and tactics. We know that these two are all old words. However, we cannot substitute them so long as we have not grasped them afresh with new meanings. We cannot take the terrible last decades of the workers' movement and the whole post-Leninist phase only as a nihil negativum, to which we make polemical references we seek to define the future limits of our action. Subjectively, however, some results have remained. It is up to us to draw the lessons that can be used precisely in the future struggle. The division of the party from the class and of the class from the party has entailed another division, the one between people and the objective perspectives they represent, between revolutionaries on the one hand and the revolutionary process on the other, to the point of making them into two opposed worlds that today do not meet or understand one another. Those who wanted to fight within the party's internal structures have not in fact done so, for want of imagining a general perspective truly different than the official one. Likewise, those seeking this alternative did not in fact find it, because they did not preoccupy themselves with maintaining real relationships with and possibilities of leadership over the bulk of the movement. These errors should not be repeated. Never throw yourself into a practical struggle without theoretical weapons. Never set yourself to building perspectives while remaining distant from the masses. The reformists will today likely need to go and fight them on their terrain, but with an army of new revolutionary ideas, with the baggage of the historical knowledge of their movements, and such clarity of foresight on the final outcome of the struggle, and such control over its internal passageways, and such awareness of its transient contradictions as to stupefy the traditional world of politics itself with all its naive erudition. Tactics and strategy, in the world of things, keep them objectively divided and never confuse or equate them, because once they have been made identical, they impede action. In subjective terms, though, in our heads, in our own person, keep them united, and here never separate them, because once they are separated, they destroy people, cutting people in two, making people into this gray shadow to which the party leader is today reduced. What seems to be the tragic side of today's situation, that we cannot do right away what we plan to do tomorrow, is the reality of the class struggle when those struggling find themselves beyond the level of organization achieved and want and demand that this primary condition be imposed so that they can then move to the decisive attack. And it is not enough to just recognize this, for once it has been recognized, it ought to be taken as a positive fact, a necessary period that has to be lived all the way through, which compels us to mount great subjective development, prolongs the time in which to prepare our forces, and makes these forces both deeper and clearer. Thus, the more one-sided we are, the more whole we are. The more we are political realists, the more we are high-level theorists. The more we are merely human, the more we are complex mediations of the working class interest. And all of this the other way around, too, in a circle of continual collective growth. They have already told us that there is nothing universally human in all that we propose, and they are right. Indeed, here there is nothing of the bourgeoisie's particular interest. Have you seen a working class struggle with a platform of generically human demands? There is nothing more limited and partial, nothing less universal in the bourgeois sense than the struggle which workers wage on the factory floor against their direct boss. It is precisely for this reason that we manage to add together these struggles across society, to tie them together in a perspective, to unite them in organization, and we will thus have the world's destinies in our hands. For we will have conquered the most powerful weapon thus far imaginable, the power of decision over the movements of capital. This, indeed, is the point we need to reach. Anything that does not serve this end should be abandoned. It is worth giving a hand to carry whatever is strictly necessary, the essentials for the journey. Likewise, it is possible that a pause along the way, at who knows what moment, may become necessary, perhaps even right away. From the prologue in heaven to the adventures on earth, this passage has not yet proven to be imminent. The whole way of seeing here presented is not only itself provisional in the world of things, it is one that still seems possible. So, let's measure it against the other possibilities. Let's see if it has grown enough to defend itself and to go on the attack. Let's test what strength it has. Certainly the working class today is no longer the young comrade, quote, who wanted the right thing but acted in the wrong way, end quote. It has now reached the age of a mature adult, a stage in which one sometimes prefers not to act rather than make a mistake. And the agitators thus find themselves using a language that sometimes isn't best suited to the present situation. Once we have established the need to change the world, we have no need to depart from or change the Brechtian line of conduct suggested by the, quote, control choir, unquote. And I guess this piece finishes with a poem from Brecht, or like a fragment from a poem. It takes a lot of things to change the world: anger and tenacity, science and indignation, the quick initiative, the long reflection, the cold patience, the infinite perseverance, the understanding of the particular case, the understanding of the ensemble. Only the lessons of reality can teach us to transform reality. End quote. Brecht. And that's the end of the introduction to Workers and Capital by Mario Tronti. And this last bit that I read is from September 1966. There's also, I think, wouldn't he say before in the preface that this is a translation of like the 1970 edition or 71 edition? But there's also a thing that's here that says note on this edition, and it says here the text of the first edition is reproduced without any changes. The date we have put at the end of each text forbids any posthumous replacement of the words or concepts. For its part, time, even if a short time, has already done justice to its own past. This naive and sentimental stretch of politics, here and there some summary execution of a living problem, and everywhere that late romantic problem of formally posing things. The, quote, next errors will not be of this type. The postscript, which has its own date, gives an account of the subsequent course of this research. It is a list of problems that have not yet all been resolved, a program of study for young forces whose minds are open to the discoveries of critical consciousness, a realistic becoming aware of today's struggles based on a new yardstick of political judgment on real worker struggles of yesteryear. As for the rest, it's best to keep quiet on things we don't yet know what we should say about. 28th of January, 1971. Okay, so that's the end of the introduction and the prefaces and the table of contents of Workers and Capital. Right now, the only thing that I can commit to when reading this is reading what I think is part 2 of the book, which is titled Initial Theses, which has the piece Marx, Labor, Power, Working Class. Even though actually looking at the table of contents, again, the first part of the book actually isn't that long. It's only like 100 pages, so maybe I'll read that. I don't know. And I think it's all essays, so I could probably read some of them at least. Anyway, thank you so much for listening.